So we thank you for being here, and we welcome you, and we're very, very glad to have already a good group of you, and probably a burgeoning group as the afternoon moves forward, to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. and also to help us ring in our 50th anniversary year. This is our first event. Creative Response to Conflict turns 50 right now, and so we are grateful for your being here to mark this milestone, and particularly with such a needed and important conversation. And so I first actually I want to thank our very many co-sponsors for this event. While we welcome folks from around the country, we are a Rockland-based organization, Rockland, New York, and so we are very thankful to have the support and participation of a number of community organizations in Rockland. And so we thank the Spring Valley NAACP, the Martin Luther King Multipurpose Center in Spring Valley, MAID Transitional Services, Power of 10, Rockland Immigration Coalition, Rockland Coalition to End the New Jim Crow, the Community of Living Traditions, Proyecto Faro, Filipinx Solidarity Collective, Combit Neg Lakai, Rockland Jews for Immigrant Justice, the Center for Safety and Change, and Rockland United. We're grateful for your supporting this work and this conversation, and sharing it with your networks. And so we invite folks to check out the great work of these organizations. And just a little bit more housekeeping. In addition to recording and simulcasting through WJMS Media, thank you, Jamie Bowles. And again, for folks just coming on, know that Jamie is here with us and kind of making sure all of her tech goes well. So she is sort of a silent participant, and we thank her for spreading the reach of this important panel. That I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. And we like to begin our events this way, and our trainings and our groups this way, and see it as the practice of respect and recognition for being a guest in someone else's space. And so we acknowledge that we gather on traditional territory of the Ramapo Lenape people, and this is the ancestral area of Hackensack, Tapan, Rumachinank, and Munsee and Ramapo clans. And they are the original stewards of this land, from which most were removed unjustly. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And as we remember the stewards of this land, let us acknowledge that restorative justice and restorative practices, which we train on and speak about, that these practices come from these original stewards of the land. And we want to thank the people who, upon the first settler contact, had lived here for at least 3,000 years, and whose history with the territory is at least 7,000 years old. And let us be mindful we are on stolen native land built by stolen labor of enslaved Africans. So let us thank Native Americans and African Americans for sharing their cultures and practices with us, despite the havoc European settlers wreaked on their societies. And let us take time and make the effort to understand societies before European contact and how those impacted live today. Let us be mindful of the ongoing impacts of colonization, slavery, and loss of culture. And we are mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all of our relations. Let us commit to ending injustice and restoring balance to Mother Earth. And so with that, I just would like to move us into our panel today. And so I'm just going to stop this share for a moment, and I want to first let you know just the format. We are going to begin with the panel, and then we'll move to a sort of fishbowl conversation between the panelists, and then have some questions that folks can ask the panelists directly. And then we'll break into small groups and be able to have some smaller conversation. The panelists will be in each of the groups, and then come together for some final thoughts and maybe last questions maybe that arise out of the groups that we probably won't be able to answer in full today, but for ongoing conversations together. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists. So we're joined today by Latriece Clark and Sherly Fabre and Cris Houston, and we're very, very lucky and thankful for their wonderful participation. They're all three dynamite, and so I'm very excited to hear from them. And so Latriece Clark is former co-executive director and current Truth and Reparations Fellow at the Truth Telling Project and the coordinator of the Grassroots Reparations Campaign. And Latriece is a former instructor at Coyne College and a Ph.D. candidate in depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, specializing in community liberation, Indigenous, and eco-psychologies. And Sherly Fabre, and actually we flipped them. So we're gonna actually start with Sherly and then Latriece and then Cris. So I should have switched the order of the bios, but Sherly Fabre is the board chair of the Truth Telling Project and a member of the Grassroots Reparation Campaign Advisory, a member of the Muslim Peace Fellowship and Community of Living Traditions. She's the representative to the United Nations for the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and she is a founding member of Proyecto Faro. And Cris Houston is an attorney and a mediator and a law professor, an equity officer, and a racial justice activist who volunteers with Harvard Alumni Association Early College Awareness Program, Lone Star Legal Aid Pro Bono Attorney Program, Houston Volunteer Lawyers Pro Bono Attorney Program, and the Trinity Baptist Church Micah 6A Ministry Team. And so we thank the three of them very much for joining us. And we're going to start with Sherly Fabre.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us to discuss this important event. And thank you to all the wonderful women that are joining me today and Liz and doing this Zoom. So we're here today to talk about reparations, and I'm going to give you just a brief history on reparations. We can all acknowledge that the Black community has been harmed by white supremacy, and that harm is ongoing. And the act of making reparations is a choice to begin to make right these wrongs. Ending harm, i.e. slavery, is not the same as compensating the victim for the consequences of that harm. To quote Malcolm X, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's still not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. So ending slavery is equivalent to pulling the knife out from the stab wound, while compensation is the equivalent of healing the wound. Both need to happen, but only the latter is reparation. So how do we move towards racial healing and transformation? So what reparations is and how does it move us towards that? Reparations is a process that has been used for repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and whose fundamental human rights have been violated. Those groups that have been injured have the right to obtain from those responsible for the injuries that which they need to repair and heal themselves. According to the International Commission of Jurists, persons entitled to reparations are not only the direct victims, but also other persons who have suffered harm as a result of the violation. Also, reparations are not foreign to the United States. Native Americans have received land and billions of dollars for various benefits and programs for being forcibly exiled from their native lands. The US government has also paid $1.5 billion to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. And additionally, the United States, via the Marshall Plan, helped to ensure that Jews received reparations for the Holocaust, including making various investments over time. So there have been individual cases of people, suing for reparations. And one of the first cases of reparations in the US was by a person of African descent was in 1783 when Belinda Sutton, who was born in modern day Ghana in 1713, was sold into slavery as a child to a man named Isaac Royale in Massachusetts. After 50 years of enslavement, she was made a free woman when Royale fled to Nova Scotia. Sutton then petitioned the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for a pension. And in 1783, she was awarded a pension for 15 pounds and 12 shillings to be paid to the estate of Isaac Royale. So I only have a short amount of time, but I'm going to give you a number of examples of reparations. And I will be sharing through the chat more links where you could look up more examples and more information about it. And I highly encourage you to please check that out. So one of the most famous cases or most famous instances, as we all know, I think about 40 acres and a mule, specifically Special Field Order 15. So this was the first major opportunity that the United States had where it should have atoned for slavery was right after the Civil War. The Union leaders, including General William Sherman, concluded that each Black family should receive 40 acres. Sherman signed Special Field Order 15 and allocated 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land to Black families. Additionally, some of those families were to receive mules left over from the war, hence 40 acres and a mule. Yet after President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Jackson reversed Field Order 15 and returned the land back to former slave owners. So instead of giving Blacks the means to support themselves, the federal government empowered former enslavers. For example, in Washington, D.C., slave owners were actually paid reparations for loss of property, i.e. the lives of the formerly enslaved. This practice was also common in nearby states, and many Blacks were with limited work options, returned as sharecroppers to the very same land for the very same slave owners to whom they had once been enslaved. Slave owners not only made money off the—
I'll take them to like 4:35.
Folks, please remember to put yourselves on mute.
Slave owners not only made money off the chattel enslavement of Black Americans, but they even made money multiple times over off the land that the formerly enslaved had no choice but to work. So skipping a little bit ahead in the timeline, in 1853, there was a woman named Henrietta Woods, and she was a free Black woman, and she was living and laboring as a domestic worker in Cincinnati. When she was tricked and lured across the Ohio River into the then slave state of Kentucky by a white man named Zebulon Ward. Ward sold her to slave traders who then took her to Texas, where she stayed until the end of the Civil War. Woods eventually returned to Cincinnati and in 1870 sued Ward for $20,000 in damages and lost wages. In 1878, an all-white jury decided in Woods's favor, with Ward ordered to pay $2,500, perhaps the largest sum ever awarded by a court in the United States in restitution for slavery. So we're going to do another little skip in the timeline to 1969, which was when the Black Manifesto was launched in Detroit. And the Black Manifesto was the first actual general call for reparations in the modern era. And it was penned by James Forman, former Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee organizer. And it was released at the National Black Economic Development Conference. The manifesto demanded $500 million in reparations from predominantly white religious institutions for their role in perpetuating slavery. About $215,000 was raised, mostly from the Episcopalian and the Methodist churches. The money was then used to establish organizations such as a television network and the Black Economic Research Center. So starting in the early 2000s, a number of states did issue some apologies as well as some financial compensation to survivors of their forced sterilization programs. And these forced sterilization programs happened after slavery. And so then skipping ahead to 2019, when Senator Cory Booker introduced the first bill for reparations, which is Senate Bill 1083, better known as HR 40, to ask Congress and the Senate to commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. And the Senate would provide for a commission to study and report back and to deliver verdicts on different proposals. So in 2021, the Congressional House Committee voted to recommend the advancement of Bill H.R. 40, which would provide the creation of this commission. That bill was introduced by Shayla Jackson of Texas, a Democrat of Texas. And so just to give you like an example of, how this has been rolled out, this is not like a new concept in international law, and other countries have actually
Hi, how are you?
done.
Hi, how are you?
Folks, please put yourselves on mute.
Other countries have actually doled out reparations. So for instance, Germany in 1952 gave $822 million to Holocaust survivors. Canada in 1988 reached a long delayed settlement with the Indigenous community there and gave back 250,000 square miles of land to First Nations and the Inuit. And in 2015, the Japanese provided $8.3 million to provide old age care to Korean comfort women who were survivors of that those camps in World War II. So to conclude, being that it's Martin Luther King weekend, I just want to read you a quote from his I Have a Dream speech, which goes as follows. "We have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherly. And I am going to, you're going to stop your share, right?
Sorry.
That's okay. And then that's great. I wanted to go to speaker view. So, and thanks for folks who've just come on, and I'm going to apologize because I meant to say a couple of words before we started. So I'm just going to jump in and just say just a moment's words worth, because I meant for folks to also just be aware as you're listening to our wonderful guests that the National Coalition for Blacks for Reparations in America and COBRA recently put out their harm report that's focused on the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance and systemic racism in America. So they are basically, the findings come out of Johns Hopkins. And I just wanted for folks, as we're listening and thinking about what Sherly and Latriece and Cris are talking about, to keep in mind that in addition to the psychological and the material harms that resulted from slavery and the legacy of white supremacy, there's evidence for ongoing biological, or genetic impact of racism. And so in thinking about, harms, to be thinking about it on multiple levels, to know that it's very, very deep harm that we're talking, in addition to all of the horrific exploitation and violence. And so with that, I want to invite Latriece to go next. And thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I do want to start just by also acknowledging the land that I'm currently occupying here in Chicago, which has traditionally been Potawatomi, LBGY, and Menominee nations. So I do want to acknowledge that. Thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. So what I'm going to talk about is just sort of building on what Sherly was speaking about in terms of current cases and examples of work that's being done in the movement for reparations. And I'm going to place that within the context of what the UN recognizes as 5 forms of reparations. And so I'm going to start by talking about restitution. Restitution is basically the restoration of victims' rights, property, citizenship status, things of that nature, right? So when we're talking about reparations, it's usually often within the framework of a larger conversation with, transitional justice, restorative justice. What can we do post-conflict for victims to feel whole? And so things that are happening currently, like Sherly mentioned, is, the bill of HR 40, right? Establishing that commission to study the effects of slavery and discriminatory practices against African Americans here in America, right? And recommend different remedies for including reparations. So just to give you a little bit more of a context, that bill, HR 40, first being introduced by the late John Conyers, was introduced in 1989. So groups like NCOBRA have been fighting for decades, right, to try to get this bill passed. If you are not familiar, one thing that I would recommend for you to read is Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations in the Atlantic. And that sort of sparked more momentum for reparations in recent years. He spoke in front of Congress, and the bill has actually picked up steam and have become one of the most supported, with 195 co-sponsors in Congress, but it still has only barely made it past the House committee, right? We're not able to get it passed into law, even though we have so many people that have signed on, congressmen and women, for the bill. And they're kind of dangling the carrot in front of the horse, right? They keep moving what's needed in order for the bill to pass, like how many co-sponsors are needed and things of that nature, to stall the bill from being put into place. And so if you worked in Washington, folks who work in Washington say no, it's very difficult to get a bill with that many co-sponsors passed, like a third of that even, right? And so the fact that there are that many people who have signed on and the bill is still being stalled in Congress sort of just lets you know the extent to which we're fighting up against in order to just even have the commission to study the effects of slavery for African Americans on that federal level. The next is rehabilitation, which is, psychological and physical support, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Another form is compensation, which we must include meaningful transfer of wealth as a means of restitution, right, and recompensation. Satisfaction. And satisfaction is basically acknowledging of the guilt, right? The apologies, a formal apology, burial, construction of memorials, things of that nature. And so Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative in building the lynching memorial or the erection of the African American Museum, right? These are examples of constructions of memorials and things to sort of acknowledge what has happened in our nation's history, tell the truth about what has happened in our nation's history, and give people that opportunity to learn that history as well. And finally, there is the guarantees of non-repetition, right? Reformation of laws and civil and political structures that led and fueled the violence in the first place. So there have been a number of local efforts to address historical harm committed within Black communities. For instance, in Asheville, North Carolina, they've committed $2.1 million toward funding for reparations, pulling funds from the city land that was purchased back in the 70s that was part of the city's urban renewal program, which tore apart Black communities. So they're attempting to reconcile that by setting aside that money to restore Black communities. Evanston, Illinois is doing something similar where they set aside funding for help Black residents with home ownership, right, due to the history of redlining in their township. They've sort of done a little bit of research and history on that and decided to come up with setting aside funds to help Black people become homeowners in their town. Due to that popularity of reparations, and many other cities are sort of following suit. They're kind of starting their own efforts, such as Boston for their role in the transatlantic slave trade, Massachusetts, looking at the centuries of systemic racism. California has put together also and developed a task force to study reparation proposals, looking at the migrations of Blacks from the Reconstruction period to California and how they can sort of look at reparations for that. And Chicago is actually currently conducting a study on how to use R3 tax money, which is money from the marijuana dispensaries, to invest in historically Black disenfranchised communities on the South Side. So even though we're having that stallment with HR 40 on the national level, local level, cities, and even on the grassroots level, people are pushing for their own form of reparations, right? So one thing that it's important to also sort of think about is, even though there are these, great efforts picking up steam, it's important to acknowledge that when we're speaking about healing, when we're talking about reparative acts, any attempt to remedy or make those impacted whole would be futile if we're not also changing those power structures that in the dynamics that led to that in the first place, right? Which created and allowed that transgression to occur. And so if we're only talking about reparations in terms of writing a check, we're not changing any of the systems or structures in place. And that's why we think reparations should be more than that, right? It has to also change the power dynamics in which these harms are operating so that it doesn't continue. So going back to that UN 5 forms of reparations with providing psychological and physical support, when you think about being a part of the Black and Brown community, right? How difficult it can be to address things like state-sanctioned violence, right? When you're watching your people being killed by police officers, many of them not being brought to justice, right? The psychological and traumatic effects that can have. And then we're talking about how Ms. Roberts also shared in Cove's report that the transmission of that trauma from slavery epigenetically, right? So we're talking about generations and compiled with current injustice that we're trying to reconcile, and we're trying to figure out how can we stop those things from continuing, but then also how could you ever really compensate for that, right? How can we begin to have that conversation about healing and things of that nature? And so that uneven application of the law, tearing apart communities, the war on drugs, all of those things, the new, peculiar institution, the new Jim Crow, how can we start thinking about breaking those things, those power structures, and how white supremacy and things are operating within those structures to end them and bring about something better. So some of the things that people are doing on the grassroots level, efforts such as, shopping to push to shop Black, right? Mutual aid efforts to share knowledge or skills sets, interest in Black land sovereignty projects, to build safe and inclusive communities like Sankofa Farm and Soul Fire Farms, right? These are some things that people are doing on the grassroots level. And what we're doing at the Truth Telling Project, we began as a group of community organizers in St. Louis in response to the killing of Mike Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri. So our co-founders, organized actual local hearings for families that were impacted by police violence, and have since launched the Grassroots Reparations Campaign. And we advocate for the idea that reparations is a spiritual practice, right? There is a deep healing that needs to happen in America of the wound around slavery. And we also organize congregations, right, across the nation to atone for their role in the complicity of perpetuating slavery. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but there's something that's called the Slave Bible, where they intentionally took out passages about freedom, about rebellion and things like that, and gave them to slaves to make them more complicit. And so that's sort of part of what Sherly was speaking about in her presentation with the Black Manifesto and James Forman having demands on how to restore and repair Black communities. So, reparations is more than writing that check. It's actively holding yourself accountable and choosing to divest from the systems and structures that allow violence to continue against Black and Brown people. And that can be, I've seen people go from supporting JP Morgan Chase, right, for their role in the Dakota pipeline to, changing their bank to something local. It can be whatever act that you feel is within, comfortable for you, but then also you have to be willing to step outside of your comfort zone, right? Be more than just an ally and really fight and see the harm that's being done on that greater level, and how you can do that, have conversations with folks, right? Advocate on behalf of the systemic injustice. We cannot have reparations without truth telling, and we have seen how dangerous it can be when we choose here in America to remain in denial about how, our past is impacting our future. Things like making critical race theory a political debate, right? Ignoring the warning signs that led to the insurrection on January 6th. So until we're able to tell the truth about the pervasiveness of white supremacy in this country, we really can't start having conversations about how to remedy its effects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Latriece. So many thoughts and responses, and I'll invite Cris now to begin, and we'll all talk some more after we've heard from our final panelist. And Cris, you're going to share your screen?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Give me 1 second to do this screen share. Good afternoon, everyone. I am here in Texas. I'm a native Houstonian, but I am residing in Waco at this time. And I want to give you my personal reasons for being a supporter of the various movements for reparations. I began to really give some thought to reparations in the context of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, and the centennial was last year in 2021. And I've never seen a situation. They have about 4 survivors who are 100 years old or older, 3 of whom were lucid enough to testify before Congress, which seems to me to just be, how do you have people that old still living and lucid unless there's just some reason for justice to be served. But I want to look at the Tulsa Race Massacre. Some of you may know about it as the destruction of Black Wall Street. We learned about it in my historically Black college, which is Hampton University, as the decimation of Black Wall Street. And this is one justification for reparations that has historical and current impacts on people in our community. So I want to start by making this real. There are some survivors who testified before Congress, and I'd like to just briefly listen to them tell their stories. Here, that's Miss Fletcher and her brother.
During marking the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, when a white mob attacked residents, homes, and businesses in a predominantly Black neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, 3 of the oldest living survivors shared their childhood experiences and lives following the massacre, including Leslie Benningfield Randall, who accused the city and local entities of fundraising and profiting off the massacre without consideration to the survivors. This is about 2.5 hours.
Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Forego questions of the first panel, and we will simply, unlike most Congress people, just listen and learn. Our first witness is Miss Viola Fletcher, also known, if I can, Mother Fletcher. Thank you. Mother Fletcher is the oldest living survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. She was 7 years old when she lived through the massacre. Mother Fletcher, you are now recognized to testify.
My name is My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm the daughter of Lucinda Ellis and John Wesley Ford of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm the sister of Hughes Van Ellis, who is also here today. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. On May 31st in 21, I went to bed at my family's home in Greenwood. Neighbors of Tulsa, the neighborhood I felt asleep in that night, was rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture, community, heritage, and my family had a beautiful home. We had great neighbors, and I had friends to play with. I felt safe. I had everything a child could need. I had a bright future ahead of me. Greenwood could Excuse me, yeah. Still, Greenwood should have given me the chance to truly make it in this country. Within a few hours, all of that was gone. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see Black men being shot, Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California. But most of my life, I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day, I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while, the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me to enrich myself and its white allies through the 30s million raised by the Tulsa Centennial Commissioner while I was continued to live in poverty. I am a 107-year-old and have never been seen justice. I pray that one day I will. I have been blessed with a long life and have seen the best and the worst of this country. I think about the terror, horror inflicted upon Black people in this country every day. This subcontinuity has the power to lead us down a better path. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask the survivors and descendants to be given a chance to seek justice, open the door. All of you know how easy it is to deny that a violent mob threatened your lives and took your property. For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its Chamber of Commerce told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother Hughes, panelists. We live this history and we can't ignore it. It's our lives with us. Oh my goodness. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for Black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For Black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans, that's some justice. Yes, was that it? Thank you.
Do you want to say anything else?
Thank you for indulging me. I don't feel like I or anybody on this panel can tell that story better than she did, because it is a story that kind of speaks to why those of us who have worked for reparations do the work that we do. She spoke of all of the things that were lost and how 100 years later, the impact of that massacre that destroyed everything that they had worked so hard to accumulate has still left her living in poverty. A couple of notes. I will share these slides with Liz so that she can share them with you. There's a link to Ms. Fletcher's testimony in writing if you would like to use it. Her younger brother, Hughes Van Ellis, also is alive and lucid and was there to testify, and he speaks of his experience. You will find it at the 003118 mark in that recording. I encourage you to listen if this is a cause that is near and dear to you. So I'm going to be quick because I wanted her to speak. I did not know any of the survivors or know about them, but I want to tell you in my presentation how I came to understand the fight for reparations. And I want to show you some pictures of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the decimation of Black Wall Street to make it real for you. And then I have a few concluding remarks about why we need reparations, not only monetary, but knowledge reparations. So I was a research assistant for Professor Charles Ogletree, who was one of the attorneys who filed reparations litigation in the federal courts in Oklahoma for the survivors, such as Ms. Fletcher, in my first year of law school at Harvard. I can't advance the slides. I'm sorry. Please bear with me. I have no idea what this computer is doing. I'm just so glad it didn't do that during the video. So this is Professor Charles Ogletree. He is one of the social justice advocates who stand out at the faculty of Harvard Law School. There are many others, but he was one of the trailblazers. And so he was my professor and I was his research assistant. So Ogletree joined a group of lawyers who in 2003 sued the Oklahoma governor, Tulsa mayor, and chief of police in federal court on behalf of more than 125 survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre. You can look up the case. It was Alexander versus Governor of Oklahoma. And the gist of that case was a slap in the face. It basically said all of this was wrong, but too much time has passed for us to engage in any sort of reparative justice. And we all know there's no statute of limitations on murder and other crimes. And so it was just a crock of you know what. But anyway, it really was. So I want to give you some snippets of the article, Tulsa Reparations, the Survivor's Story, through the eyes of Professor Ogletree. That article is linked here in case you want to read it in detail. But let's look at some of his comments about the movement for reparations through the lens of those fighting using litigation as a tool. So Professor Ogletree states that reparations lawsuits, especially those framed as traditional civil rights claims, as in the lawsuits for reparations for the Tulsa race riot, can begin to promote the convergence of interests between reparationists and the reluctant majority population by forcing the majority population to confront past and present injustices against African Americans. Litigative reparations are a promising first step toward ensuring justice for those who were sacrificed during slavery and Jim Crow oppression. Reparations advocates are deeply committed to the goal of reparations for descendants of African slaves and do not believe that popular acceptance of the effort can or should drive the movement. Reparationists do not seek the endorsement of the majority of the American population or even the majority of the African American population for what we do. We do not seek your vote, your support, or even your encouragement when engaging in this type of advocacy, because the motivations that sustain us come not from public accolades, but from empathy with our clients, those who survived the violence of slavery and segregation, and those who did not. One of the fundamental goals of reparations for African Americans is to ensure that those who were sacrificed are not forgotten in our rush to move beyond the painful lessons of our past. But reparations is more than an exercise in education and remembrance. Reparations advocates ultimately seek the redistribution of resources from one group to another. To that extent, reparations is another manifestation of the progressive agenda articulated by President Lyndon Johnson and his vision of addressing the needs of the Great Society. Reparations is, in other words, yet another expression of the demand for political, social, and economic equality that, since the failure of the civil rights movement in the 1970s, has been stifled and suppressed in this country. So this is the last bit of snippets from him. He says reparations is controversial and distinctive because race is one of the criteria justifying this redistribution. Those who are to pay should do so because they injured a racially identifiable group of people. In fact, the link between race and injury is closer than this. Those who inflicted the injury did so using race as perhaps one of the many justifications. In addition to wealth redistribution, the major goal of reparations litigation, one that is generally underemphasized, is knowledge distribution. Reparations also publicizes the voices of the alienated African Americans. So here are a few pictures. This is what Greenwood, as Ms. Fletcher refers to the area, it looked like. It was a thriving Black community. It was known as Black Wall Street because of the amount of wealth that had been accumulated in the area. It was the wealthiest, I believe it was the wealthiest Black city in the nation at the time. 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private airplanes, plus a hospital, a bank, post offices, schools, libraries, law offices, and even a bus system. Some communities today still don't have that amount of resources, and they had it over 100 years ago in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So this is the people moving about in Tulsa, looking healthy and well. More businesses, a theater. And this is J.B. Stratford. He was perhaps the wealthiest African-American man alive at the time, and he lost everything. He was the owner of the Stratford Hotel. There were 2 grand hotels that probably would have rivaled something like the Four Seasons or the Ritz-Carlton today. I don't know why this slide thing is freezing.
Oh, yeah.
Liz, I usually mute them, but I'm not able to do so and operate these slides that are not cooperating
on the
with
mute.
me. So let's just look at this view. It seems to work better. So this is the bombing or the burning of Black Wall Street. They had planes. I don't remember the name of the oil company, but it is asserted that there was one of the major oil companies at the time, Sinclair, I believe is who it was, who lent planes so that they could bomb Greenwood overhead. Not only were there bombings, but people were forcibly removed from their homes for days. They were warehoused in a certain location that escapes me, and they were slaughtered. It was men, women, and children. So this is what it looked like after Black Wall Street was decimated. This is how much destruction took place. So reparations, what does it mean? Basically, it's the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. And we have a principle which is called restorative justice, and it runs throughout our legal system. It's why people who have been convicted of a crime even have to pay restitution to victims or their families. And restorative justice is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior. It's best accomplished through cooperative processes that allow all willing stakeholders to meet, although other approaches are available when that is not possible. Restorative justice can lead to transformation of people, relationships, and communities. That's the reconciliation part that comes after the truth has been told, as my sisters on this panel referenced earlier. And restorative justice is not just for crimes that have been prosecuted. It's also for crimes against humanity, such as the genocide and economic crimes that took place in Tulsa, Rosewood, and even today and beyond. So why do we need reparations? I want to borrow from the words of Rashawn Ray and Andre Perry. And Sherly kind of touched on this in Dr. King's words in the beginning of this panel. But central to the idea of the American dream lies an assumption that we all have an equal opportunity to generate the kind of wealth that brings meaning to the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, words that are boldly penned in the Declaration of Independence. The American dream pretends that with hard work, a person can own a home, start a business, and grow a nest egg for generations to draw upon. This belief has been defied repeatedly by the US government's own decrees that denied wealth building opportunity to African Americans. So what does that look like? Today, the average white family has roughly 10 times the amount of wealth as the average Black family. White college graduates have over 7 times more wealth than Black college graduates. Making the American dream an equitable reality demands the same US government that denied wealth to Blacks for hundreds of years, might I add, restore that deferred wealth through reparations to their descendants. Additionally, reparations should come in the form of wealth building opportunities that address racial disparities in education, housing, business ownership, and other sectors of our society. I have linked the article, Why We Need Reparations for Black Americans, here as well, if you would like to review it. And with that, I will conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, Cris. 3 of you were amazing, and this is a very comprehensive panel with very many important aspects of reparations and the conversation, that is ongoing. And what I'm thinking is, if you have questions or you have comments for each other first, that, maybe you can engage each other, and then I can certainly begin the process, and then we'll open it up to folks. But I want to be sure you have a chance to comment or ask each other things right away.
I have a question for my sisters on the panel. I gather most of you are in the New York area, and I would just like to ask if you can speak a little bit about ways that people who wish to get involved with this work can get involved.
Thank you for that question. Latriece?
Sure. So one of the things that we sort of promote with the Truth Telling Project, we have various events. We have an upcoming reparations course that you can be a part of. A lot of people network and connect with folks who are doing work locally there. A lot of the people that we present on to speak in the course are involved in various things. And so we try to share information about what's going on at the grassroots level. So I'm happy to get that over to Elizabeth, the information. She can mail it out to everyone who has registered, just so that you can have that information. But if you want to go on our website, it's the truthtellingproject.org and the Grassroots Reparations.org as well. We also have organized events for Reparations Sundays, so you can kind of learn more about the role of reparations as a spiritual practice, and how you can even host your own DIY Reparations Sunday to have conversations within your congregation about things that you can do. We work with various Quaker communities who have actually started their own reparations efforts and set aside funds from their congregation to support different Black-led initiatives. And so definitely contact me if you have any questions. I'm happy to share resources.
Excellent.
Thank you, Latriece. And I just want to add, also, I'm a part of a Black Land Justice farm, which is called Cabilio in Massachusetts. And as Latriece mentioned, there's Soulfire and other farms. So there are other opportunities of people being able to get involved directly with things, as well as to learn more. And I just want to, taking a moment from what Liz asked us, I just want to say to Cris, thank you so much for sharing that information. It was like really powerful to hear, like from their own voices, what people went through. And it's really, I feel kind of enraged that they put these people, elderly people, through all of this. I mean, going to trial at any age is horrible, but to have lived through this, gone through this, seen the wealth that you work so hard with no resources and no help, right, to build up, and see it being torn down, how much like it would affect you to like have to live through that, to have your own country bombing you, you know what I mean? Like it's like obscene. And then to have everybody go through that and just to say, oh, sorry, we can't do anything. Like, why even start it? This was like, it was beyond. But anyway, thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Latriece, for your presentation.
You're so welcome. And I toyed with the idea of whether or not to include Mother Fletcher's testimony, because it was about 5 or 6 minutes. And I just felt like nobody can talk about why we need reparations better than those who have suffered some immediate and serious injustice as a result of being descendants of slaves and having to live in Jim Crow. So her brother testifies, and there are a few others in that snippet that you should listen to, but it just made it real, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm wondering, I always have sort of my organizer brain on, and in thinking about, folks, learning about the historic calls and the current, campaigns and things happening. I'm wondering whether there's kind of what your thoughts are on sort of strategic priorities. I'm wondering about whether there is some larger national kind of coalitional efforts to get folks on a similar page in terms of strategy. I know the Movement for Black Lives, has a strong sort of piece of their platform that's focused on reparations, but I also know there's, folks who've been, doing work before the emergence of Movement for Black Lives, and so I'm just curious about how kind of the conversations are moving ahead so that there is sort of a unity in terms of strategy. And I guess a piece of that question is also about the, what is your thinking and, your sort of question about how much time to spend doing the sort of grassroots work of educating and mobilizing to do that cultural shift toward a more reparationist perspective versus spending time and energy on the kind of legal, electoral, HR 40 kind of piece of advocacy, because both are, needed, and just curious about your thoughts on strategy.
So I am a lawyer, and so that litigation space, that legislative advocacy space is probably comfortable for me in ways that it isn't comfortable for everyone. And so the first thing that I want to say, and then I really want to shut up because Latriece and Sherly have much more insight on this, is that there is no wrong way to lend a helping hand to this movement. Even if you just do things like raise awareness of the Tulsa race massacre in your community, in your circles, things like commemorating Dr. King with things like this. Last year, we did something that highlighted Brian Stevenson's work for equality and justice. So that's the first thing I want to say. The world is so big. Our circles of contact are small yet big. Do something. Do something that is well-informed and well-planned, but do something.
Thank you, Cris.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I agree. I think there's just so much work to be done that that different organizations and different groups kind of lead in their area of expertise. So like if you, like Cris, who's a lawyer, will lead in like the litigation. Latriece and I, who are grassroots organizers, will lead in other aspects. So I can speak for the Truth Telling Project, which tries to engage like religious communities to do the work, because we think of the spiritual aspect. But to go back on what Latriece mentioned, the UN has 5. So first, I think, before I speak on the UN, I think like true reparations can only come if the US government decides to do it, right? It has to be like yes, other states and people can do, should and can do it, themselves, but it has to be like a thing that the government of the United States does. And in order for them to do that, there has to be like the pressure, and there has to be a change in culture, right? So you could only change in culture by chipping things away little by little, right? And even then, it's like it ebbs and flows. So so going back to the UN 5 points on reparations, I think like different organizations are taking, different points and working on those things. Like Latriece just put something about changing, the name of a square from the name of somebody who was an enslaver to somebody in the African American community. So that would like guarantee like satisfaction, right? Truth telling is another way to like bring the bring it to the forefront, and that's another part of satisfaction. But it also goes to guarantees of non-repeat. And I think until like people understand fully like all that's going on, they won't be able to like move to like what I feel is like the most important aspect, which is like guarantees of non-repeat, because then that really shifts like policy. I saw somebody put a question in the chat, and we could go over it more, but just to kind of answer, I think the question was basically like, why don't we focus on specific instances, because we can say that these are wrong, as opposed to something like overarching like reparations. I think it's because we already know these are wrong, right? There's no denying that slavery was wrong, Jim Crow was wrong, and all these current policies, redlining, everything, like this is wrong, right? I feel like it was just like when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, right? And decided to speak out against what was going on, the police violence. And then not everybody, a lot of people just built this like huge like counter, right, resistance to pretend like they didn't understand what he was saying. But then when the George Floyd situation happened, there was just like no denying, right? But before George Floyd, this was already happening, right? And you already knew it was wrong. It just got to the point to where you couldn't deny it. And I think people get to the point to where they can't deny it when it's just like flooding your space, right? So yes, it's easier to do something like Tulsa and say like this is wrong, and to do those instances. But the reason that Tulsa didn't get any there was no resolution, and the reason that a lot of times when you see these police cases, even though you see what they're doing, right, there's no resolution, and people are like, well, what happened before, is because the culture hasn't shifted to like really believe that Black Lives Matter, right? Because if you really believe that, then this wouldn't even be a question, because we already know the wrongs are wrong, right? So it's about like giving people a different perspective as to like not only why these wrongs are wrong, but like why fixing them is not only a Black issue. This is not reparations for Black people. This is reparations for America and the wrongs that it has done, and the way that everybody talks about, we're so divided. We won't heal if you're not trying to heal. Like you can't have a wound and not sew it back up together and just assume that it's just gonna like close. Thank you, Latriece.
Thank you, Sherly. Latriece, did you want to?
I was just going to add to that. This is basically what Sherly was saying, that there, we partner with other organizations who are doing similar work, and we try to help and operate with one another the ways that we use to folks who are interested in as well.
Great, thanks. The afternoon has flown by, and what I think is that we should I think we're going to have to forego the small groups, but let's open it up for some questions. And I think that Catherine, hang on a second, where did she go? Catherine Childs, I think, may have been the first person to ask about opening it up for questions. So maybe Catherine, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you so much. So I think my question is literally piggybacks off of what Cheryl was just saying about accountability and the United States government willingness to participate in this process in any kind of authentic way. And when I think about the foundations of restorative justice that are really founded on the voluntary nature of participation, I just find that super frustrating, because I feel like there's calling people in, that's ideal, and then there's calling people out. And if we talk about meeting people where they are, And in the process, there are people who continue to be oppressed and repressed, and these reparations aren't happening. I just feel very frustrated about the foundations of restorative justice and this piece around accountability and the power over, and how do we achieve that accountability?
Would our panelists, would anyone like to respond to Catherine?
My sisters hinted, or not even hinted, outright spoke on it, Ms. Childs. Before there can be any reconciliation, any redress, any reparative or restorative justice, there must be truth. And one of the things that we can do, because I'm scanning those of you who have your cameras on, and I'm assuming that all of us have a few more resources, be they educational, be they financial, than some of our counterparts in America. And what we can do is utilize those resources to make sure that people are educated enough so that when we reach enough of the people who care about this and who want to do something about it, that we can develop a critical mass of people who say, it is time to take action. But one of the beautiful things about the Tulsa Race Massacre in the eyes of those who committed it is that they just scrubbed history of it. They took it out of the history books, and no one spoke of it. So people could not be as hurt and as outraged as we are today, listening to one of the survivors. And that's just one example. There are millions of examples if you go back 400 years. And so the biggest thing that we can do to even create a foundation for accountability is to educate. That is why my god-awful state has attacked whatever they think critical race theory is, because what they think it is isn't what it is. But I believe that part of the reason for these laws that say what we can and can't teach in schools is this. I'm hearing my white counterparts say, tell me what I need to read. Point me to information, because I'm taking this home to grandpa and mom and dad, and I'm educating them, and I'm trying to challenge them to rethink what we thought was true. They know that that education is a groundswell for change. That is why it was illegal to educate us in slavery. They knew we would not remain oppressed if we knew the truth. So before you can have accountability, you got to have truth. America doesn't specialize in that. I hate to say it. They don't.
Thank you, Cris. Indeed. So I also want to say, like, there are other, avenues that we can like chip away at this. So one thing is, like, if you see like a bill for reparations or something happening, and like I said, there, and like Latriece pointed out, there are different states that are doing different things, to write maybe a letter of support to that, or maybe just like write a letter of support to your congressman or to your senators for the bill HR 40. I think the US government doesn't act unless it sees like people pushing it in that direction, right? So I think like doing that push. I think it's also important to like attack education from different levels. So if you're, for instance, like have a community theater, or you have some kind of like different forms of entertainment, like you can teach people things without them even knowing that you're teaching them through like different entertainment. If you're a writer and you can write, like, so like whatever your talent is or whatever you can do to like support the movement, I think it's always moved forward like that, with everybody doing their part in it. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, and I see Dolores's hand. I think the whole notion that David Ragland kind of stirred in me when I went to a Truth Telling Project meeting once with Sherly, and I think Latriece may have been there, but I'm not positive. But I do recall, just a strong emphasis on the culture shift, and that, like Sherly saying, the culture shift happens because in lots of areas, the language and the discourse is about these different narratives and different ideas. And so I've been thinking a lot about the issue of restorative justice being something that we're busy trying to encourage more of and encourage a culture shift and a paradigm shift for that. And so it's very synergistic with people hopefully starting to understand reparations, right? If they start to sort of see that, you know, we can't, for instance, punish the US, right? You know, what do you do about big crimes against humanity when it's at the level of nation, right? We can't punish. So we, you know, repair is a very, you know, reasonable thing that, you know, could help people kind of get around, like, how do we deal with these wounds, and how do we have accountability for these wounds? And as far as the energy we put in, right? You know, we want restorative justice, but also, as Frederick Douglass said, power can seize nothing without a struggle. So we need for the demand to be at the level of, you know, movements and large numbers of people in order to get that shift happening, right? Just like Black Lives Matter has enabled the country to more frontally sort of take white supremacy, you know, as a national identity thing versus just a Southern thing. That's what lots of Northerners like to do, think that white supremacy is this like extreme Southern thing. And Black Lives Matter's organizing and the ways in which folks have risen up has enabled folks to shift, you know, that thinking. And so I'm gonna, I saw that Dolores had a hand, and then I saw Steve. So hang on, Dolores, you want to go ahead and unmute? You've got a question for?
Yes, thank you. Is it only questions, Elizabeth, or a few comments, if I may?
That's okay. That's okay.
I couldn't even pretend to or attempt to be nearly as lucid as this panel, or nearly as informative and logical and well thought out. And thank you. As much as we think we know, we never know it all, clearly. And I don't pretend to be any kind of expert on reparations, but I've attended a couple of NCOBRA events. And I will say this, and not in perhaps the best order. Spend some time thinking about, are people inherently bad? Are they inherently good? What the heck really goes on in the nature of us human beings? Where's the compassion? Where's the humanity? Yada, yada, yada. Bottom line for me ended up being, no, people are primarily good. But what messes up everyone along the way is misinformation, disinformation, lack of information. They don't know better, so they, whoever they are, right, not progressives, can allow themselves to fall prey to these very easy, but you know, hugely untrue statements. One of the best things that were, what I saw one of the slides that mentioned about the reparations component not only being so much about, well, one of it being education, and in the process of obtaining reparations and showing the American people why this is absolutely necessary, we want to defend and explain what's gone on. And I think in the process of doing that, there's so much that's going to unfold, right? It will explain why critical race theory is necessary. We need to know our history in order to know how to fix everything that's been horrifically done by the powers that be. So all this to say that, you know, I love talking points where I can. One of the easiest things for all of us to do is to begin talking, and it's not incumbent on Black people to keep educating us about what we need to know. We need to know, but there's so many books to read about a lot of things. So, you know, even when I heard that point, and I'm finishing up now, and Steve White, you can go next. But when I didn't know about people were held in a warehouse for some days as part of the Tulsa race riots or massacre, and then slaughtered. I mean, that part I didn't know. I don't know the depth of it in terms of the hundreds of thousands. You know, similarly, I've read about Rosewood, Florida. I don't know about others. And if it some kind of talking points, even if we were to collectively build some and distribute them, I think people would commit to sharing them with the people they know. Tulsa, Rosewood, et cetera, and something, some details to substantiate how horrific and brutal these massacres were.
Thank you, Dolores. Steve?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, such great presentations. It's really appreciated. And, I just chimed in to add, people were talking about education and the need for this to be national. And I was remembering that the United States is like one of the only countries not to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, which includes the right to an education. So there isn't really now even really a national right to an education. So, and by ratifying that treaty, that's something else that could be done to help get education, which is also part of reparations, not just so that we can learn more about what happened, but also because this is another way that we can help to repair the damage that was done, was by providing education to all children. And there is an international convention that the United States hasn't signed, and we can advocate the United States ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child. And there's been an international push also for education for all children called the Abidjan Principles that, the United States could participate in. Because while we're pushing for better education, a lot of the white communities are setting up like segregation academies. They've been setting up to exclude their children, even above and beyond the current push to erase history of racial injustice in public schools. Already the ones who are in private schools, there's no rules. Something right here in New York, we could push for adequate education in private schools, because right now, even though it is the law in New York, many students in private schools aren't getting any education in the history of this. So there's a few things that we could push for on the education front that would address this in different ways. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Yes.
Real quick.
Oh, go ahead. Does someone have a comment?
Yes, Sherly.
Great.
Thanks. Thank you. Sorry, just to go back on what Dolores said, I just want to say something. So when you were talking about whether people are good or bad, I feel like sometimes people like address things like this, but I just want to say, like, there was I forgot the gentleman's name and it really bothers me, but he was making a point when talking about racism to like not say like you're racist or you're not racist, or like you're good or you're bad, because nobody can really like I don't know you, right? So I don't know if you're good or bad, but you can point out like whatever you are, like this thing that you did was good and this thing that you did was bad, right? That you can say. So I think that like puts people in a different mind frame also to be able to hear you. But also I think one of the things about critical race theory was like, oh, we don't want people to feel bad, right? Like we don't want children to feel bad, but it's like, no, this bad thing happened. So if there's like empathy for it, then it's because this is bad, right? And not because we're saying like all white people are bad, right? So I think like those kind of nuances are sometimes important to like bring up. And as far as education, like what's to answer Mrs. Childs' questions, like what similar to what Steve brought up, like so it's important because educating people about what happened isn't only important for like the white community. There are like even within the Black community, people who don't know like some of the things that happen, right? Because it's just not being taught, or you learn some of the wrong things, right? Like if we think of how we all learned the story of Thanksgiving, and then now as adults, we're learning like the true story of Thanksgiving, this is not the same thing, right? So being able to like have your country really teach the truth and not the propaganda of what happened is like an important historical lesson to all of us, right? Also, when you think of things like, even if it's not just, and it's not just like, oh, like Tulsa happened or Rosewood happened, right? But other things like, until, and this is like, I felt like was such a shame, like until I think it was like 2015 or 16, I don't know when the movie came out, but there was this movie called Hidden Figures. And until then, I didn't even know there were Black women working at NASA, much less Black women who worked at NASA who helped people land somebody on the moon. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous that you didn't know that, because if a white man invents Post-its, like we're all gonna know his name. But if like Black women help somebody like land the first men on the moon, and we didn't even know that they were even working at NASA, right? And then you're taught, like, as a Black woman, like, oh, there's not really a lot of you in like STEM, right? But Black women like invented so many things, like, and Black people in this country invented so many things, like the elevator, like maxi pads, like the gas mask was invented by Black person, stoplights, right? So you don't know any of this history, and you're just like, now because of the internet, thank God, and because not just the internet, right, but because of people that I follow, I can learn these things. But people follow the things that they're interested in. So if you're a Black person and you're not exposed to some of these things, and you're not following it, and you're following like pop culture, right, you don't even know some of these things about your own history. So that's why it's important. Like, education is important for us all to learn about this. And it's really sad that we don't think of this as like Americans who invented things so that we can put it forward, and we just like erase what Black Americans have invented and what women have invented, right? Because misogyny and racism go hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherly. I'm wondering if our panelists have anything else to add here. I think I see one more hand up for a question, but before we take our last question, do Cris or Latriece want to add anything?
I'm adding comments in the chat. I would like to hear from Mr. Pessin.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to go ahead and unmute?
Sure, thank you. First of all, I guess I can just say, speaking on behalf of the Rockland Coalition to End the New Jim Crow, we're really so honored to have Latriece and Crisala and Sherly speak to us on these issues. We also had NCOBRA come to our meetings, and we are, supporting the changing of the statue in Savannah, of Calhoun. That has to go. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is there's long-term and short-term goals. I mean, honestly, the long-term goal is a complete transformation of American social and cultural and political ways in which we do things in this country. I think we have to transform the whole thing in order to really move ahead ultimately. But short-term, I have a suggestion, and I was wondering whether or not this has been considered before. It just came to my mind now. When you fill out your tax form, there's a space where you can check a voluntary donation to go to political candidates. And so what I'm thinking is maybe in line with HR 40 or maybe separate legislation, or wherever we are, any kind of political entity, we have a voluntary check that $2 or $1 of my taxes goes for reparations. So I'm just throwing that out as a possibility of maybe doing something so we get off, dead center and move ahead. That's a suggestion. I don't know if it's reasonable, possible, or even doable, but I wanted to throw it out to you guys.
And while we're at it, we want X percentage for housing, X percentage for healthcare, X percentage for education.
And we don't want half of our tax dollars to go to the military the way it does right now. So I would like to see whether our panelists would like to respond and kind of any last comments. It went too quickly, but I want to respect folks' time today.
I do, and I guess I should start by saying this. I've already sent Elizabeth Roberts my slides, and so she will share them with everyone who has registered today, including those who were able to be present. The only other parting comment that I have is this. I want to thank Sherly and I want to thank Latriece, because I want you guys to know, and my sisters, if I'm giving up the tea and telling information that might be internal, just forgive me. But I want you to know that speaking up about reparations and working to win reparations in large and small ways takes a great deal of courage. Courage that I think we should applaud Sherly and Latriece for, because even within the Black community, everyone doesn't support this work. And so there is strength in numbers. And the more that we can do to just educate the American people, the more help, the more soldiers in the Army we will have. And so I want to thank them, because this is something that I dabble in. They're working on it in the front lines constantly. So thank you, both of you.
Thank you, Cris.
Thank you, Cris.
Thank
for
you.
the work
Yeah.
you do, because definitely the legal aspect is like so important. Thank you for answering all the questions in the chat. It was so lovely working with you guys. I hope we continue to work together. Thank you, Elizabeth, for bringing us all together, and I will send you my slides.
Great.
And just thank you everyone for joining and you know, being open to learn. And I hope that you check out some of the things that we put in the chat, where you could learn more and you could get involved more. And I hope that you're able to you know, have enough knowledge to be able to start these conversations elsewhere, because you know, sometimes it does feel like you're preaching to the choir, but I feel like we give the choir more hymns so they could go out and, you know, bring in everybody else. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherly. Latriece,
I
parting.
just want to echo all of that. Yes, thank you, Cris. Thank you, Sherly, and thank you all for your, just like you said, showing up, being present. That's half of the battle, right? So being receptive to learning and increasing your knowledge in this area. I did share my contact information. Thank you, Ms. Roberts. So feel free to reach out.
We're so grateful. It's been really, really wonderful, and may we find opportunities to continue these conversations together and to expand, you know, the numbers of folks who are thinking and digging for deeper analysis and solutions, you know, and for folks, you know, in addition to, you know, generously donating to local organizations that, you know, Black-led organizations that are doing justice work, please support, you know, groups like the Truth Telling Project and the Grassroots Reparations Campaign and Cobra. And I'm going to put the links again, you know. Creative Response to Conflict is very, very grateful that you've helped us, you know, mark the beginning of our anniversary with such an important event. And we, of course, would love to be able to keep doing these events. So we, of course, encourage you to also donate to CRC. And I'm just truly moved to really have a chance to think together and you know, may we all continue to find ways to be more and more effective in sharing knowledge and you know, opening conversations and passing on resources. And here's to liberation and ending white supremacy and a world that's safe and just. And so wishing you all a wonderful day. And I'm gonna just send those links so you don't, and you can always make sure you find your chat. I think it should download the chat for you when you end your meeting. But have an excellent day. And thank you so much, Latriece and Cris and Sherly, for giving us so much to think about and explore today. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Liz.
Bye.
Thank you all. Great presentation.